Good afternoon, everybody. It is great to be back with you on this beautiful Lord's Day, and it's awesome to see churches able to start meeting again together, and really glad we are here at Zephyr Hills. Things have gone really well, and it's been good to be back with our brethren, especially to be back in person, and I hope many more churches are able to do the same in the coming weeks, and Lord willing, we'll get past all this challenging stuff together. But I want to turn our attention today back to the Gospel of Matthew. We'll pick up where we left off in the last video from the Gospel of Matthew, and today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 11. In Matthew chapter 11, this is right after in chapter 10, Jesus had sent out his 12, or he was preparing to send out his chosen 12, and Jesus was letting them know how challenging, how difficult it was going to be. It wasn't going to be just, easy peasy, but they were going out as sheep amongst wolves, and that things were going to be hard, but they needed to endure. They needed to continue to have faith in God, have faith in Jesus, no matter what. Well, then in Matthew chapter 11, picking up in verse 1, "Now it came to pass, when Jesus finished commanding his 12 disciples, that he departed from there to teach and to preach in their cities." So Jesus has commanded his 12 disciples to go out, and Jesus then leaves himself to go continue to teach and to preach in the cities. "And when John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples." Now this is talking about John the Baptist. Remember, John the Baptist had started preaching the kingdom of heaven, the gospel of the kingdom, but he was arrested, and now that he's in prison, he is sending messengers to Jesus with the question in verse 3, that they said to Jesus, "Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?" So they want to know, are you really the coming one? Are you it? Now there's debate as to, was John the Baptist already knew before he was in prison who Jesus was and knew that Jesus was the chosen one. So, is this John beginning to have doubts, or is this John doing this for the benefit of his own disciples to go and to see Jesus and what Jesus is doing? Well, Jesus then answers in verse 4. If you'll look there with me or listen along. "Jesus answered and said to them, Go and tell John the things which you hear and the things which you see. The blind see, the lame are walking, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are being raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them, and blessed is he who is not offended because of me." And so Jesus, the disciples of John the Baptist come, say, "Are you the one? Are you the coming one? Are we looking for another?" Jesus says, "You go and report to John everything that you're hearing, everything that you're seeing." And he says, listen, those who are blind, their eyes are being opened. They're being able to see. The lame are being able to walk again. Lepers are being cleansed. Dead people are being raised. Everyone, the poor are having the gospel, the good news preached to them. And then Jesus tells them, but here's what it comes to is, are you going to believe Jesus and acknowledge and confess Jesus and follow Jesus, or deny Jesus? And Jesus says, "Blessed is he who is not offended because of me." Well then, as those disciples of John, those messengers from John, as they leave, Jesus then turns to the people. He turns to the multitudes in verse 7, and he starts to talk to them about John the Baptist. And so in verse 7, he says, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see?" Because that's where John the Baptist had been, if you remember. That's where John had been, where he was baptizing people in the Jordan River. And so Jesus says, "What did you go out to see in the wilderness? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? No. Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. So Jesus is telling them, he's revealing to them that, listen, John is that chosen prophet, the one that was going to come before the Christ and prepare the way for the Christ. That he is the messenger of God, preparing the way of the Lord for the Christ. And in verse 11, Jesus says, Assuredly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater even than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. And so, now Jesus is, he just finished talking to them about John. That there has risen no one greater than John, but the point of the kingdom, the good news of the gospel, is that the first will be last and the last will be first, as he says that he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And then he begins to talk about the kingdom of heaven and the wrong that had been done towards it, that from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Jesus now tells them, listen, there's a prophecy made at the end of the Old Testament that in Malachi, that God was going to send Elijah back, or send one in the spirit of Elijah. Well, Jesus is revealing to them here in Matthew 11 that John the Baptist is the fulfillment of that prophecy, the fulfillment of Elijah. John the Baptist is the Elijah that was coming before the Christ to prepare the way of the Lord. And so Jesus then goes on to say, But to what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their companions, saying, We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament. Well, what did he mean by that? Why is Jesus giving that illustration? Well, he goes on to say, because John came neither eating nor drinking, and they said, Oh, well, he must have a demon. John, his diet consisted of locust and wild honey. John the Baptist did not eat or drink much of anything. As far as, what normal people would, the Pharisees said of him, he must be crazy. He must be a madman. He's got a demon. But Jesus, he says, verse 19, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they said, Oh, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children, Jesus says. Nothing was going to make them happy. John came and he didn't eat and drink what, people normally would, and they thought he was crazy. And then Jesus comes and Jesus does eat and drink, and they say, well, he's a sinner. No matter who it is that came, whether it was John the Baptist coming as Elijah before the Lord, or Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. These hypocritical Jews were not pleased with anyone God sent. And so Jesus really makes that point clear to them here in Matthew chapter 11, verses 18 and 19, as we just said. God was doing everything he could to bring us the good news of salvation, to bring the gospel. But it's up to us to believe it and to obey it and to follow Jesus. Do not be offended by Jesus. Do not be ashamed of Jesus. Confess Jesus. Have faith in Jesus. Be confident in Jesus and hopeful, and grow in faith and in hope and in love. And that's what we need to do today. And we need to be followers of Jesus. Well, we'll leave off there, and next week, Lord willing, we'll come back and look at Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 20.